everyone, and welcome to this lecture. We're continuing to look at medieval theology. So last time we spent our time exploring some of the controversies that developed as we moved out of the patristic period into the medieval period. And this was a time when they were beginning to think about things like the Eucharist, icons, and then there was the split between the Western and the Eastern Church. And we started to talk about something called scholasticism, which is the beginning of kind of a rational way of thinking about faith. Now, we're not saying that you can reason your way to belief or faith, or that you can somehow explain God or faith or whatever. What it is faith-seeking understanding. And so scholasticism is the beginning of the development of the university system that comes out of the monastic system, and someone like Anselm of Canterbury, who is the one who coins that term, faith-seeking understanding, begins to explore different rational ways of kind of supporting what we believe. And so I want to talk about two things with Anselm. One of them is the ontological argument for God's existence, and then the other is the satisfaction theory of the atonement. Now, I want to explore the ontological argument as Anselm describes it, and I want to do so recognizing that I'm not a philosopher, and so there's going to be a lot in here that I'm going to leave out. It might seem very simplistic, a simplistic rendition. And the other thing that I want to emphasize by this is I'm not talking about the ontological argument because I think it will work, if that makes sense. I'm not saying we can take this argument and go out and try to kind of convert people with it. What I want to show is how the ontological argument is dependent upon a kind of particular philosophical worldview. And that goes along with this idea that we've been talking about, like, what are the conditions of our belief? What are the philosophical tools that we're able to use to kind of make sense of faith? And the ontological argument, as Anselm describes it, is really grounded in a Neoplatonic understanding of the world or reality. So what is the ontological argument? So I'll just give you the 5 points that I have here and then talk about how these points are grounded in that Neoplatonism and how it makes sense if you're a Neoplatonist. So it starts by saying God is that which no greater can be conceived. And so what Anselm wants to say is if you can get someone to agree with the definition of God, that God is that which no greater can be thought or conceived, Anselm then believes that God must necessarily exist. So he starts with this definition of God. God is that which no greater can be conceived. Then goes on to say, if God is that than which no greater can be conceived, there's nothing greater than God that can be imagined. Therefore, there's nothing greater than God that can be imagined. If God does not exist, there is something greater than God that can be imagined. Therefore, God exists. So one of the things that this leaves out is existing in the mind and existing in reality. So if God exists in the mind alone, what Anselm would argue is it's possible to think of something that exists in the mind and in reality. And to exist in the mind alone is less real than to exist in the mind and in reality. So what is he doing? Let's think about the tree. So the material tree participates in the treeness that exists in the heavenly realms. And the most real thing in a Neoplatonist reality isn't the material tree, it is treeness that exists in the heavenly realms. And so in a Neoplatonist kind of scale, things that exist in the mind alone or that are imaginary, so like a unicorn or a hobbit or those types of things, they have an existence, but it's less real than something that exists in the mind and in reality. And so what I want you to see here is this. If God exists in the mind alone, then there's something greater than God, something that exists in the mind and in reality. And by God here, we're using a lowercase g. We're not yet kind of talking about, which God it is, but we're simply saying that if God exists in the mind alone, then there's something that is greater than God, that which exists in the mind and in reality. But the definition that we've given to God is that which no greater can be conceived. Therefore, the very definition of God contains within it the necessity for existence. That the definition of God, little G-O-D, the highest thing that we can conceive of, is something that must exist both in the mind and in reality. This is the ontological argument. It's arguing for God's existence from the very definition or understanding of the Word of God. Now, we have made no claim, and Anselm makes no claim about who this God is or what this God is. What is the greatest that can be conceived, that exists in the mind and in the reality? Could we say it's the cosmos or Jupiter or whatever? Sure. But what Anselm then does is he makes the leap of faith to say, and you, O God, you are this God. So you can see how faith-seeking understanding is not saying you can use this ontological argument to prove that God exists. You can use this ontological argument within a Neoplatonist framework to provide evidence for belief in the God that we believe in by faith. So that is the ontological argument as Anselm describes it. Now, this argument takes on, and again, there's more to it than this, and this argument takes on different forms as it continues to move through different philosophers. There are philosophers to this day that are still wrestling with the ontological argument. But Anselm is one that we see as really beginning this process and making the argument from this definition of God. And what I want you to see is how this argument makes sense within a Neoplatonic framework. Now, we will talk about other arguments for the existence of God when we get to Aquinas. And Aquinas is going to come from an Aristotelian perspective, and so it's going to look very different. But for now, I want to move on to one other important contribution of Anselm. Anselm writes this book, Why God Became Human, and he's wrestling with the incarnation, and he's thinking through the idea of atonement. What happens on the cross of Jesus Christ? Now, what he does, up till this time, a lot of Christians had what we might call kind of a Christus Victor view of the atonement. And there was a lot of different views. But what this Christus Victor view of the atonement focused on is that what God is overcoming is evil and sin and really the devil. That God is in conflict with the devil or Satan and is seeking to save humanity from evil, sin, and Satan. So the question to be asked here is, what is humanity being saved from? And for a lot of people in the patristic church, the answer was the devil, Satan, sin, hell. What Anselm does, though, is he shifts it. So for Anselm, he's going to begin to look at the work of Jesus Christ in the terms of kind of a feudal economic theory. It's an economic view of salvation. And what he uses here, talks about, is the issue of honor. What is it that humanity owes God? And that in an honor-shame society, honor became very integral to the relationship of of individuals and the community. And so what happens is Anselm is going to shift the what are we being saved from question from we're being saved from the devil to we're being saved from God, and we're being saved from God's wrath. And so the argument goes this way: God creates humanity, Adam and Eve, in the garden, and they owe God everything. They owe God their honor and due as the creator and the Lord of all of creation, and love. And love is a part of this. And so the relationship between Adam and Eve and God is a covenantal relationship of honor and duty and love. Now, what is sin then? Sin is taking from God what God is owed. And in doing so, humanity dishonors God and breaks that relationship. And I always try to use this example, and I don't know if it works or doesn't work, but it's the example of you're dating, and you have a boyfriend, girlfriend, and one of them, heaven forbid, cheats on the other. It doesn't really do any good for the person who's cheated to come back and say, hey, let's pretend like this didn't happen. And the other person to be like, oh, okay, we'll just go on. Because what's happened? Well, trust has been broken. Something has been taken away. And so now the person who has done the wrong has to go above and beyond to repair that relationship. They can't just come back and say, let's make things the way they were. They have to go above and beyond to demonstrate their fidelity and their trust and earn back that faithfulness. So in a weird kind of limited sense, this is what's going on. Like, humanity can't just come back to God and say, hey, we're sorry, let's just call it good. They owe God something. They owe God what they have taken from God. But now they need to go above and beyond to offer a gift of propitiation that makes up for the wrong that has been done. The problem, however, is that humans owe God everything already. There's nothing that humans can give that's above and beyond. So we've taken from God the honor that is due God through sin and the alienation that comes from that. And therefore, God's wrath now comes upon us. But to overcome that wrath, or to make up for that, restore that relationship, we can't just give our back what we owe. We have to go above and beyond. And the problem that Anselm points out is we just can't. It's not going to happen. We already owe God everything. And so what happens then is God becomes human in Jesus Christ. He is perfect. He does not have to die. And yet Christ goes to the cross as a gift, offers his life as a gift that goes above and beyond. And again, becomes human so that humanity is making the sacrifice. So the humanity of Christ has to be there because it's humanity that has done the offending, and the divinity is there because it allows for that kind of above and beyondness. Jesus Christ is a perfect human being, fully God and fully human. And so this is where the idea of the sacrifice of Christ on the cross is a gift, an act of propitiation. And what happens then is Anselm's theory leads to this idea of a treasury of merits, that Christ has gone so far above and beyond that there's an abundance now of merit that has been earned by Jesus Christ. This becomes, in the West, a big part of the Catholic understanding of atonement and the sacramental system and salvation, but it also becomes a part of purgatory. So when we get to Luther and start talking about his opposition to indulgences, for example, it's important to understand how Anselm's view of salvation and the satisfaction theory leads to this creation of a treasury of merit. So what are people doing when they give an offering, do an act of charity, light a candle, say a mass for the dead who are in purgatory? They're not trying to earn salvation by their own merit. What they're doing is tapping into this treasury of merits, tapping into this grace that is going to then be bestowed upon their loved one who is in purgatory. Now, it's important for us to see that at this point, grace is understood as a substance, kind of like honor. Honor is seen as a resource, like a scarce resource. If you give honor to one person, you're taking it away from another. And in the same way, grace here is a substance, and there's a way of transferring or tapping into the abundant grace of Christ through the mechanisms of charity and mass and kind of the works that we do. But it's very important to understand that that grace is not based upon my work. That grace is based upon the work of Christ that has already been done, that then leads to this transference. Now, it's important that when we get to Luther that we understand Luther is not opposed to indulgences. He's opposed to the abuse of indulgences that he sees with Johann Tetzel. And then as things escalate, only then does he move to question the whole kind of indulgence theory. But to understand, I think, Western Roman Catholicism, we have to understand the satisfaction theory of the atonement and understand this idea of merit, of grace, of the treasury of merits. And it all of a sudden unlocks this understanding of the sacramental system. Grace as a substance that comes to us through these material things, through water, through bread, through oil, through confirmation, all of these things. And this is a part of this kind of system of salvation, this economy of salvation, if that makes any sense. Now, Luther and Calvin, when they come along in the Reformation, they're not going to challenge necessarily the wrath part. What are we being saved from? God's wrath. But they are going to change the metaphor. And the metaphor is going to move out of a feudal economic system into a judicial system, in one sense, to undermine purgatory and to kind of go after purgatory. But what I want you to see here with Anselm and the ontological argument and the satisfaction theory of the atonement is how they're beginning to use reason as a way to construct these kind of doctrinal perspectives. Now, again, for Anselm, reason does not lead to faith. I mean, it can support faith, but you still have to take a leap of faith. It's still belief. And one, important point that I want to make that I forgot to make about the satisfaction theory is this is why when we go into a Roman Catholic church, we find at the front a crucifix and we find an altar. In the Protestant churches, we refer to it as a table. And in the Roman Catholic Church, it's an altar. Why? Because everything is about the sacrifice. I had one person say one time, well, Roman Catholics don't believe in the resurrection. I'm like, well, why would you say that? It's like, well, Jesus is still up on the cross. It's like, well, no, they believe in the resurrection. But the satisfaction theory helps us understand that the atonement is understood and the work of Christ is understood as this act of propitiation, as this gift that is given through his death. And of course, they believe in resurrection. But knowing the satisfaction theory and beginning to understand that helps you begin to make sense of, some of the furniture in a Roman Catholic church and the way that the worship space looks. So again, my point here has been to kind of unpack this idea of faith-seeking understanding by looking at what Anselm believed about the ontological argument and the satisfaction theory. And now what we want to do is we want to begin to take a shift, and we're going to shift into Thomas Aquinas. If we were to talk about who is the kind of bedrock foundation of Roman Catholicism in the West, Thomas Aquinas' theology has been very influential. And so the next few videos we'll spend some time exploring Thomas Aquinas and unpacking his thought.